using, yeah, like building Lambda functions or deploying them within the context of Docker. So you can see like what I have here, right, is I have a function called, just like Lambda handler, and it needs to take those same two arguments, right, the event and context. All right, and then it return. That's kind of the main thing that you need when you're defining a Lambda function is like, all right, it's a function. It has to take two arguments, the event and context, and then you have to return. The return value needs to be a dictionary, right, where you want to say status code 200, and then have your payload, right, your data here. So here what I'm doing is I'm using that Texas Drinks API to basically just like make my request. That's what read.json does, and then return a list of dictionaries, and then return it from there. Now, ultimately, we're gonna, this just lives on my computer right now. Ultimately, we're obviously going to move this up to AWS. Before doing that, remember, we always like to test stuff out locally, just like make sure the function works before we go ahead and deploy it. So what I would do, you can see I've been playing around with it. All right, is what I would do is like, you can cd into source, and then you can just do Python 3-i main.py, and that will run, right? That we all know that will read this file and give it, open up a console at the bottom of it, and then you can call the Lambda handler, right? And you will need to pass through it, right? If you just call it, it's going to break because you need these two arguments. So normally, like the event is a dictionary. You can pass through anything really, but if you want, you can pass through like a dictionary, just to see how it would work with when AWS calls it, and press return. And you can see that it does work, right? So we're first just printing out the content hello world, and then we're hitting our API and then returning the list of records. So that's why we have this status code 200, and then we have a list of dictionaries that follows from there. So that looks pretty good, right? That's kind of like the first step that we do. The next thing that we need to do is build a Docker image with this Lambda function defined inside of it. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, and how do we even know how to do that? So like I linked to the documentation, right? The way I know is just by looking at the documentation, and it tells you essentially how do you do that, right? So you can use one of AWS's base images for Lambda to build the container image for your function code. And then we can click on the Python link, and it tells us essentially how you do that. So this is what I did, right? I called it maybe something else. I called it Lambda handler instead of handler. But and then this is a little more complicated than I guess what we'll be doing. An example Dockerfile. I don't love actually this. Use an AWS image. Okay, this is more probably it. So you can see that it's starting. They give us the image to start with. All right. Remember, like we always kind of inherit from an existing image. So they give us like a good amount of setup here. And then the rest is really just setting up your code. Copying, the requirements.txt file from where it lives in your directory, installing it, copying, we have, I think we called it main.py. Here they copy, it's called lambda function.py. And then here is where they specify like when someone hits your Lambda function, what file and what function do you want to actually be run? Okay, so for them, it's lambda function.handler, right? It's the lambda function.py file, and then the function name is handler. For us, it's going to be main.py or main.lambda handler, right? It can be anything. So you can see this is what I have in the Docker file, all right, is I inherit from their image. Notice I am using this ARM64 because I have a Mac M1. But if you don't have that, then you can just delete this part, right? Okay, you want to just make sure that your environment, right, like that this Docker image, in terms of the kind of whether it's using the ARM64 or not, is consistent with your development environment, all right? And then what am I doing from here? I'm just copying source requirements.txt. I'm installing it, right? This has my request library, pandas. I actually don't even need this Fido3 library. I can delete it. And then we're going to copy the main.py file. And then again, right, we're kind of, this is like maybe the only thing that's a little confusing. You just have to specify what function do you want to be called when someone hits your Lambda, like what is the function that actually is going to be called. And for us, it's this main.py file Lambda handler. Cool. All right. So we do ultimately want to deploy it, but before we do that, we can actually build this thing. So let me go out one. I'm here. So I can do docker build dash -t Texas receipts, right? And then build. So I'm just tagging it here, the -t, giving it a name of Texas receipts, and then saying I want to build, right? Like this is the build context. Press return here. It's building it, installing the requirements. Things look pretty good. All right, and that's pretty good. So the next thing you can do, right? We could push this up to ECR, but actually, like I always like to test everything locally as much as possible. So what you can do actually is you can do this line, and the reading walks you through this. Docker run. So we're basically going to run this. We have this image called Texas receipts. We're now going to run it locally. So it's going to be docker run -p, and then it'll be, we'll say 9000:8080. So it's going to run inside the image on port 8080. We're going to map that to my laptop's port of 9000. It could be anything. And then we want to call the image, right, which is Texas receipts. We'll see what happens here. Okay, so this is actually running. Like our image now is running. It doesn't look like much, but it is. And the way we can invoke the function that's inside of it is by doing the following. Is actually making a curl request. So if I do docker ps, we can see that, right, this is running. And you can see really like the command is to specify the Lambda entry point. And now we can make a curl request. So we'll do curl -x. So it's going to be a post request, right? Like, and then this will be http://localhost to 9000. So I'm going to make a post request to port 9000. And this part's annoying. 2015 03 31. That's probably just the API version. Functions. Functions. Function. I probably should just copy this. Invocation. Okay, invocations. And then we could send a payload. I don't even think I need to. Oh, it actually says expecting. Maybe let me try one more thing. -d. I might not just copy this. This is kind of getting crazy. You know what? I'm just going to copy it. This is getting crazy. Sorry about that, guys. It is right here. So this is, you just have to copy and paste this. So the idea is you want to test to make sure the Lambda function is working, inside your Docker container locally before we try it out. So you can see I'm making a post request to this port 9000, right, which is mapped to 8080. This is just like calling. This is just hitting. It's basically acting like an API, and then it does make the request, right? So this is kind of interesting, right? You can think about like how this Lambda function is actually going to be triggered, and it's triggered like making a request to an API, right? And this is the route, effectively. Invocations, the route is always the same, and then this -d, this is the event, right? This is the payload that we can send to the Lambda function, and then it's going to be processed here. In this case, we're not making any use of it, but you can imagine that you are. Okay? So far we kind of like went through the steps of first running the main.py function, then calling Lambda handler from Python. Then we Dockerized it, right? Said, okay, this is what I want to be invoked. We built the image and then ran a container and made sure that we can invoke it the right way, and that looks pretty good. The next step is to actually push this up, to actually deploy this. So we can go to AWS ECR and create a new repository, and we can call this whatever we want. Texas, I'm running out of names. Get Texas receipts Lambda. It's fine. And then just click create repository. Does it? Okay. It might be complaining. Oh no, it's fine. And now let's just look for it. Get Texas receipts Lambda. So all we did was create it's basically like creating a GitHub repository, but we didn't push anything up to it yet. So you can see, right, there's nothing in there. In order to figure out how to push our image up, I recommend just clicking on this, and it'll tell you everything to do. So the first step is, we already did this basically, right? We built our function. We called it something else though. We called it Texas receipts. And so we already built it. We will need to log in, probably. So remember what this is. This is to get the login password, right? And then pass that token. This will give us a secure token. And then we're going to pass that to Docker itself, to our Docker client, okay? And that way it can log in to our ECR service. So do that. And how is it getting this password? It's getting this password because we have it in that AWS config file, right, in the credentials file on our computer. And here it says, okay, login succeeded. So basically we logged in Docker. We gave it an access token so that now it can push up to ECR. And then we just have to tag, remember our image, Dr. Image LS, is called Texas Receipts. We're going to want to give it the right name so that we can eventually push it up. So that's the next step, is just tag the image. Let me see if there's a question. What is determining this is going to be a Lambda invocation in the Docker file? Is the base image set up that way? I thought the base is just some sort of environment OS running code. I mean, yeah, it's because of the base image, Conwall, right? So the base image can be anything, right? The base image can have, this could be our, what we have here could be the base image for somebody else's Docker file. So what this is doing is, this is setting up the environment, such that all we have to do is just move in the correct, our code base, and specify what the Lambda handler is. But, everything technically is setting up your environment with Docker. But here it's setting up the environment so that we can easily, port some code over to our Lambda environment. Right, you can do it, right. So Eric kind of points out that you could just start from even further. You don't have to use this base image. You could, use something use a more generic kind of base image, but this does a lot of work for you. Cool. So what did we do so far? We logged into Docker, basically. We have this Texas receipts. The next thing we want to do is just tag our image properly. So you can see they give us essentially the code here to do that. There's just one thing we have to change, which is this is saying tag this image latest to now be called this. Our repository name, get Texas receipts Lambda. But our image name is this. It's actually Texas receipts, I believe. So I just want to change this. All right. So it's saying tag this image to be also called references this. Okay. So we're going to take this image, also be able to reference it as that. And now if I look at it, Docker image ls, I should see it. That's this guy, right? And now I should just be able to push it up. So we could actually just copy this too. Let's just copy this too. All right, and we are pushing. Cool. So this guy is called Get Texas Receipts Lambda, right? All right, and then we should see this up here in a second. Let's just refresh. Ugh, is that not there? Oh, it's still pushing. Well, while we wait, I'll get started on the next step. So what we want to do, let's go back to AWS. We basically want to now actually create our Lambda function and specify that we want to use that image in our ECR. So just go to Lambda functions. I'm going to create a new one. And look, here are the options. Choose one of the following to create your function. Author from scratch, use a blueprint, meaning use some sample code, use a container image. So this one feels right. Let's call it like Texas Receipts, Lambda, that's fine. Just call it Texas Receipts. And now here's the container image URI, just called Browse Images, right? And I just want to make sure I have the right one. It's called Texas Receipts Lambda. And let's make sure it's also over there by now. There it is. All right. So we want to do get Texas Receipts Lambda. So we'll just do find image, get text, select repository. Click on this. This is a repo. There's only one. You can have multiple images in the ECR. We only have one, right? So we're just going to select that one. And then click select image. And then here, just be careful about this. You want this to be consistent with with your environment. Remember, I'm using an M1, right? That's just the way my Mac is working. And because of that, I'm specifying that here. And so I also need to specify that here. Okay? So you just have to be consistent. That's all I ask. And then I think that's it. Yeah, we don't need any of this. Let's create the function. Everything else should get set up. So you can kind of see that, right? Like we don't have to obviously insert any code or anything because all the code is in our image, right? It just basically, all it does is it just sees the image. When you call test, it's going to do what we did, right? It's going to boot up the container, Texas Receipts, and then make a curl request, right? Make a post request with the payload as the event. Like that's how it's going to invoke this thing. So we can just call test and actually just test it probably. And here it goes. Existing function succeeded. Let's look at the details. Here it is. All right. So everything that we just did is working fine. Okay. And same thing as before. Like we can have this thing get triggered from an S3 bucket, right? From like uploading something, etc. That can trigger our Lambda function. I was going to show one more thing, but before I do, like what I was going to show next is how to actually trigger our Lambda function from the Bado library. But before I do that, anything you want me to go back on or anything confusing so far? Okay, so basically what we did was we, have a py file, a main, called it main.py, defined a function. It has to take 2 arguments, right, and return a dictionary, status code, and some data that we probably want back. And this is like what it does, all right? And then we have a Docker file that basically sets up this code base, meaning we have to copy the requirements.txt, install it, copy the main.py, right, and then specify what function we want to actually be called. Then we Dockerize it, right, Docker build, and then basically we want to create an ECR repository, and then just click on this button, view push commands, and this tells you what to do, right? To log in and how to basically you then need to tag your image properly so that then you can easily push it up. All right, and then from there we just did create Lambda function, and then we specified we want to do it from a container image. Okay. The only other thing I was going to show is what's kind of cool, I think, is that you can trigger this function. So this function is called Texas Receipts from Bada, really from like anywhere that you have the right AWS credentials. You can then, let's go here, and you can see I just added it. I really just asked ChatGPT to give me some code for calling my Lambda function, and this is what it gave me. So we're going to connect to the Lambda client. We need my function name, which is Texas Receipts, okay? And then we're going to call. Then I have this Lambda client invoke my function, okay? We're going to invoke it request response. So like the invocation type is to treat it like an API. And then this is the payload we're sending. This is my event, which we just have nothing. We don't really need it. And then we just get back a response. And then finally, here's the result. We can print the result. So if I call this, I can do Python 3. Am I in the sort? Yeah, I am. Python 3 index.py. This is making a request to my Lambda function, right? And that's deployed on AWS. So you can see it's like 9:53 at my time. So if you go to monitor and say view CloudWatch logs, we should see that it was invoked. Maybe not. I think that, I'm not sure. But it was. I don't know why. This is just silly CloudWatch. So this is calling, this right here is calling my function Texas Receipts, and then getting back some data from it. So I guess part of the point I'm trying to get to is you can really just think of your Lambda function kind of like as if you on EC2 set up an API, right? That when you make a request, it gives you back a response. Here it's the same thing, that basically the return value of my Lambda handler. The return value of my Lambda handler is me setting up a route so that when I make a request, when we hit this thing and pass through, right, any data, it gives me back a response. So it's a very easy way, relatively easy way of quickly setting up an API. And then again, you don't have to always have this thing running, which is the benefit of it. When using Docker, how do we make sure new image is used when we push the new images after making code changes in handler code? Oh, I kind of get what you're saying. So I think what Conwell is asking is well, this is kind of annoying because all you can really see is this, is the fact that we're using an image, but there's no code preview. It says AWS Cloud 9 can display your code. I've never done that.
There are versions. You can push version numbers if you wanted to.
Yeah, so that's kind of one thing. The other thing is you expect this to have a what's the impact of changing your code? Well, you have to either be logging something different or have a separate return value. So you would do that too, right? You would say all right, well, let's just return one record instead of two. And then you would deploy it and invoke the function and make sure that that's correct, right? So you would want to test it. You would want to still test this, right? Your changes and test the impact of your changes.
Hey Jeff, my question was actually regarding automation. We in the previous labs learned how to automate the process of pushing new images or code changes. But
CI/CD.
Yeah, but my question is how to use that image that was automatically pushed to deploy a new Lambda instead in place of this existing Lambda, or that is not possible.
No, it probably is. I don't know how to. I mean, you'd have to push to ECR, and then somehow you'd have to create a new ECR. So one thing to note is it is possible you'll do it with Terraform, really, So you can specify in Terraform, hey, create a Lambda function called this, and then it update the container image to be this, and then it should. Then you'd have to somehow get. I just have to look at how you would do it, but you'd have to then probably you would recreate. Probably what you would do is probably recreate the Lambda function itself to specify it's using this container image, and that way it would make sure it is synced up with the new version you're using. Yeah, if it does, I'm not sure if it does it automatically. But yeah, you can specify in Terraform that you want a Lambda, that you want this Lambda function connecting to this image in your ECR.
I see. The reason I ask this is otherwise I'm not able to understand the advantage Docker is offering here over just writing the code.
Well, okay, I like that question. Okay, so why, what are we getting out of this thing? Actually, a lot. The reason why is because you can imagine that this code here is going to become fairly complex, meaning that there might be more and more libraries that you are going to need to install. Here we're just using pandas and requests, but you can imagine that there are more complex. What if you're doing some sort of machine learning task or etc. Right? They're going to run into a couple of issues if you don't use Docker. One is just simply remember when we create a Lambda function, we're not really given too much by the way of libraries here that that we also get with this thing. We can, our only kind of technique is we can they have these layers, right, that you can add in, but those are pre-built. They're not custom. You can add in a layer that has pandas installed, etc. But building actually, right, so you can use an AWS layer, and this kind of has some libraries for you. This one has pandas, right, for you. You can see that we can do a custom layer. Custom layers I find more complicated than building Docker functions. And then the other thing is, with Lambda functions, you're pretty restricted in terms of the amount of space that you get, meaning how much hard drive you actually get to run your function. But for whatever reason, when you do this through a Docker image, they give you significantly more space. Okay, so that's another reason is these Lambda functions by default, they're set up to actually not allocate you a lot of computer resources, mainly hard drive memory, right? But when you use a Docker function, a Docker image, one, you can more easily install the pip libraries or whatever else that you want, and then two, it just gives you, for whatever reason, they set it up so they also just give you more space. So those are the reasons, right, for doing that. Sorry, this is a little. Yeah. So this, as you write more complicated code, this becomes easier to you. This is kind of the way that you'll move. All right. The other thing is testing your environment locally, right? It gets you a little bit closer towards when I did the Docker run and then made the request. That's pretty much the environment that's going to be set up locally in when I deploy my Lambda function to the cloud. So again, I always want my local environment to map my production environment as much as possible, and Dockerizing something is a component for that. Cool. Other questions? So the reading does essentially walk you through this Dockerizing Lambda. And then from there, this is also just kind of a reading serverless. These are also just readings that really provide you with the code. Serverless is an alternative to Terraform that's actually easier to use than Terraform. You don't have to know it too deeply. I basically, like I said, give you the code that shows you how you can quickly set up the infrastructure you need meaning Lambda functions, your S3 bucket, Docker, right? Just with serverless. So it's a nice little tool. And then you can see we have this sample serverless code base that you can look through. Eventually, you will have a pretty large lab that will ask you to use this thing. Maybe I give you the code for that for serverless there too. But it's good to understand and just to spend a few minutes on. All right. And then we can have, and then you can look at this. This is just like a review of EC2 versus Lambda, things like that. Okay? So this is essentially, right, like the end for now of Lambda functions. And then we'll go into Docker Compose and Airflow. All right? Cool. All right, let me